Look at him, shaking like a leaf. He can't even hold a cup of coffee, and yet he wants to leave the house?
Ethan, stop right there. What are you doing?
A teen mocked a 92-year-old Marine. Then his grandpa walked in. Sometimes the most profound lessons about honor come not from books or lectures, but from the moment when disrespect meets dignity, and we discover that the heroes we've been taught to revere have been sitting quietly among us all along, waiting for us to grow wise enough to see them. 17-year-old Ethan Mitchell thought he was being funny when he started mocking the old Marines shaking hands at Murphy's Diner. The entire football team was laughing until Ethan's grandfather walked in, saw 92-year-old Arthur Sullivan, and dropped to one knee in respect for the man who'd saved his life in Korea. Ethan Mitchell was everything wrong with his generation, entitled disrespectful, more concerned with Instagram likes than real life, treating every adult like an obstacle to his entertainment. At 17, he'd never faced real consequences for his cruelty, never learned that some things were sacred, never understood that some people had earned reverence through blood and sacrifice. What began as teenage mockery would become a life-changing lesson about heroism hidden in plain sight, proving that sometimes our greatest teachers come disguised as the people we're cruel enough to dismiss, and that honor isn't inherited. It's chosen through moments that test who we really are. Murphy's Diner, Small Town, Pennsylvania, November 2024. This was the kind of place where 3 generations had eaten the same breakfast, where coffee refills came without asking, where conversations moved slowly, and everyone knew everyone else's business, except the stories that really mattered never got told. The town had sent boys to every war since World War I, their names etched on the memorial outside the post office that people walked past daily without reading. Most residents knew Arthur Sullivan as the quiet old man who came for coffee every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, sitting alone at the corner booth, hands trembling from age as he slowly turned newspaper pages with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned patience through survival. Veterans Day weekend always brought mixed feelings to places like this. Parades that felt more like obligation than honor, speeches by politicians who'd never served, and increasingly empty chairs at VFW meetings where stories died with their tellers, because younger generations had learned to associate military service with distant news rather than personal sacrifice. Ethan's generation had grown up during endless wars that happened somewhere else to someone else, where supporting the troops meant bumper stickers rather than understanding where military service was something that happened to other people's families when college wasn't an option. Ethan Mitchell had been raised by parents who'd given him everything except boundaries, where participation trophies had replaced accomplishment, and where his mistakes were always someone else's fault, because accountability might damage his self-esteem. High school quarterback, honor roll student, college bound, his resume looked perfect on paper, while his character remained unformed clay. That hardship had never been allowed to shape through consequences that growth required experiencing. His cruelty wasn't malicious. In the traditional sense, it was thoughtless, casual, the kind of dismissive disrespect that privileged teenagers displayed toward anyone who didn't matter in their immediate social universe, especially elderly people whose relevance had expired in minds focused only on instant gratification. Social media had amplified his worst impulses when cruel content got more engagement than kindness, when humiliating others became entertainment, when respect was viewed as weakness by peers whose approval mattered more than character development. Arthur Sullivan had been Second Lieutenant Arthur Sullivan in 1952 when Chinese forces had overrun UN positions during Battle of Bloody Ridge, where leadership meant choosing who lived and who died, while enemy artillery made those decisions academic for too many good men. George Mitchell, Ethan's grandfather, had been 19-year-old Private First Class, whose inexperience had put him in kill zone when patrol route had been compromised by communication failure that enemy intelligence had exploited through tactical superiority. Arthur had crawled through machine gun fire to reach wounded George, dragging him to safety while mortar rounds bracketed their position, and survival meant making choices that medals couldn't adequately recognize, despite heroism that circumstances had demanded demonstrating. The rescue had cost Arthur his left leg and 3 fingers on his right hand when grenade shrapnel had shredded tissue that military medicine had saved, despite damage that civilian life would make permanent reminder of service that gratitude could never fully repay. Ethan's mockery of Arthur represented everything wrong with modern society's relationship to military service, when casual disrespect had replaced reverent understanding that sacrifice had earned through blood that comfort had been purchased with. The developing confrontation would test whether privilege could learn humility when faced with heroism that service, rather than social media, had created through actions that character had been proven by rather than proclaimed through. The deeper challenge was generational. Could teenager raised on instant gratification understand delayed consequences that honor required, accepting through commitment that self-sacrifice had been motivated by, rather than self-promotion that modern culture had been emphasizing? The ultimate lesson would determine whether respect could be taught through recognition or required learning through experience that loss had to provide, when appreciation couldn't be inherited but had to be earned through understanding that privilege cost someone everything. But as Ethan's cruel laughter echoed through Murphy's diner, he had no idea that his grandfather George was walking through the front door and that the next 60 seconds would shatter everything he thought he knew about heroism, honor, and the price some people pay so others can live free. Look at Grandpa over there trying to drink his coffee. Ethan's voice carried across Murphy's diner as Arthur Sullivan's Parkinson's-affected hands struggled with ceramic cup. That morning routine had become challenging, despite determination that dignity required maintaining. Shake, rattle, and roll, old man. Maybe you should switch to sippy cups. The football team's laughter encouraged Ethan's cruelty when audience approval had been more important than empathy that maturity would have provided. Arthur's response was silence that military bearing had taught. When civilian disrespect couldn't diminish honor that service had earned through actions that words couldn't adequately commemorate, despite sacrifice that gratitude should have recognized. Check this out. I bet he can't even hold a spoon steady enough to eat soup. Ethan stood up for better performance angle when mockery had become entertainment that social media would amplify through posting, that humiliation could be shared beyond immediate audience. The diner had fallen uncomfortably quiet when other patrons recognized cruelty. Despite generational differences that respect should have transcended through basic human decency, that upbringing should have provided. Bell chimed as front door opened to admit George Mitchell, whose weekly breakfast with grandson had been scheduled despite concern about Ethan's attitude that recent behavior had been demonstrating through increasing disrespect. Recognition struck George like physical blow when he saw Arthur Sullivan face that 62 years couldn't erase from memory that gratitude had preserved through daily acknowledgement that life had been gift rather than entitlement. Lieutenant Sullivan. George's voice carried wonder mixed with reverence when rank had been preserved through respect that time couldn't diminish despite civilian circumstances that military bearing still maintained. Arthur's head turned with precision that military training had maintained despite age when voice had carried recognition that civilian life rarely provided through understanding that service had created between people who'd shared mortal danger. Private Mitchell, George Mitchell, from Fox Company. Arthur's response carried emotion that decades couldn't eliminate when brotherhood had been forged through circumstances that peaceful life couldn't duplicate despite comfort that survival had made possible. Dear God, it is you, after all these years. George's approach was reverent when hero worship had been earned rather than assigned through actions that memory couldn't diminish despite time that distance had created. Ethan's confusion was complete when grandfather's behavior had contradicted everything that disrespect had been based upon, despite appearance that judgment had been formed through surface observation rather than understanding. Grandpa, what's going on? You know, this old guy saved my life in Korea. Crawled through machine gun fire to drag me out of kill zone when I was too green to know I was already dead. The revelation hit Ethan like cold water when context had been provided for behavior that ignorance had been mocking despite heroism that recognition should have been offering through gratitude. Lieutenant Sullivan, may I call you Arthur? Now, I've thought about you every day for 62 years. Wanted to thank you properly, but never knew how to find you. You don't need to thank me, George, just doing my job. But I'm glad to see you made it home and had family. Restaurant atmosphere had transformed when other patrons had begun recognizing situation that respect, rather than entertainment, had been deserving through understanding that stories carried weight beyond surface appearances. Ethan apologized to Lieutenant Sullivan immediately. George's command carried authority that military service had provided through experience that civilian life couldn't duplicate despite comfort that peace had made possible. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Ethan's apology was halting when shame had been complicated by confusion about transformation that revelation had created through perspective that ignorance had been preventing. Son, you couldn't have known, but now you do. This man gave everything so people like you could grow up free to make mistakes and learn from them. Arthur's response was gracious when forgiveness had been earned through experience that judgment couldn't provide, despite circumstances that understanding required accepting through wisdom rather than anger. George, your grandson doesn't need to apologize for being young. We all were once. Question is whether he's willing to learn what growing up actually means. What did you lose in the war? Ethan's question was genuine when curiosity had replaced mockery through recognition that story deserved hearing rather than dismissing through ignorance. Left leg below the knee, 3 fingers hearing in my left ear. But I gained something to knowledge that life is precious because so many good men died to preserve it. The physical evidence was suddenly visible when understanding had provided context for struggles that age alone couldn't explain, despite damage that service had inflicted through sacrifice that choice, rather than obligation, had motivated. Why didn't you ever tell me about Lieutenant Sullivan? Ethan asked George. while family history had been revealed as inadequate despite pride that stories should have been preserving through remembrance. Some stories are too important for casual telling, son. Some debts can never be repaid, only honored through living worthy of sacrifice that others made for our freedom. But as Ethan began to understand the magnitude of his cruelty, Arthur was fighting his own battle against time, against memory, against the approaching Veterans Day ceremony where he'd promised to honor fallen comrades one final time, not knowing that fate would require him to pass that sacred duty to the teenager who'd mocked him. Tell me about Korea. Ethan's request came during follow-up visit to Arthur's modest apartment when curiosity had replaced cruelty through recognition that education, rather than entertainment, had been required. Bloody Ridge, October 1952. Chinese forces had numerical superiority, better positions, weather advantage. We were holding defensive line that couldn't be allowed to break despite casualties. Arthur's apartment was shrine to fallen comrades when photographs and mementos had been preserved through memory. That survivor's guilt had maintained, despite time, that healing couldn't provide for losses that remained permanent. Your grandfather was good soldier, brave, reliable, followed orders even when orders seemed impossible. Problem was experience that green troops didn't have for staying alive in situations where mistakes were fatal. How many men did you lose? Ethan's questions were becoming more serious when understanding had replaced casual curiosity through recognition that answers carried weight beyond academic interest. 17 from my platoon, good boys who never got to come home, never got married, never had children like your grandfather did. Their sacrifice made your life possible. Physical evidence of Arthur's injuries was becoming apparent when observation had been guided by empathy rather than mockery, through understanding that disability had been earned rather than pitied. Medical discharge in 1953. Took 2 years to learn walking again, 5 years to accept that military career was over lifetime, to understand that surviving meant responsibility, to honor those who didn't. What responsibility? Living worthy of their sacrifice, making sure their stories don't die with me. Teaching young people like you that freedom isn't free, it's purchased with blood of people who chose duty over safety. Veterans Day ceremony is next week. I'm supposed to read names of local boys who died in Korea, but Arthur's admission revealed health challenges that age had been complicating through Parkinson's that public speaking would make difficult. My hands shake too much for reading, voice isn't strong enough for Memorial Park acoustics. Might be last ceremony I can attend, and I'm not sure I can honor them properly. What if I helped I could read the names while you stood beside me? Ethan's offer surprised himself when service had been volunteered through understanding that honor required participation rather than observation. Son, that's generous offer. But these names aren't just words on paper. Each one represents a person who died believing their sacrifice mattered for something larger than themselves. News of Ethan's transformation had spread through small-town networks when behavior change had been observed through interactions that respect, rather than ridicule, had been demonstrating during visits to Arthur's apartment. Football coach says you've been missing optional practices to spend time with some old veteran. Team wondering if you're losing focus on what's important for senior year success. Maybe I'm finding focus on what's actually important beyond winning games that nobody will remember in 5 years, compared to stories that should never be forgotten. George's pride was evident when grandson's character development had been witnessed through commitment that maturity, rather than obligation, had been motivating despite social pressure that conformity had been creating. Your parents are worried about college applications that community service hours with elderly veteran might be taking time away from despite scholarship opportunities that football performance could be providing. Then they don't understand what Lieutenant Sullivan has been teaching me about priorities that matter beyond personal advancement through achievements that serve self rather than others. Veterans community had begun noticing when Arthur's isolation had been relieved through companionship that young person's interest had been providing despite generational differences that connection had been transcending. VFW members say Arthur's been more social lately, attending meetings he'd been missing for years. Having someone who listens to war stories makes difference for veterans whose experiences civilian life can't understand. Character growth through historical understanding. 200 Turu Ethan's education had expanded beyond textbooks when primary source history had been provided through personal testimony that academic study couldn't duplicate, despite factual accuracy that emotional impact had been adding. Korea was forgotten war because it ended in stalemate rather than victory, but men died just as dead as any other conflict. Their sacrifice deserves remembrance regardless of political outcomes. Why don't we learn about this in school? Ethan asked while curriculum gaps had been revealed through stories that education had been omitting, despite importance that understanding would require including. Because textbooks can't bleed, son. Can't show you 19-year-old boy crying for his mother while medic tries to hold his intestines inside body that shrapnel has opened like can of beans. Personal responsibility was emerging when privilege had been recognized as debt rather than entitlement, through understanding that comfort had been purchased through sacrifice, that appreciation required acknowledging. I've been taking everything for granted: freedom, safety, opportunity. Never realized these things cost someone everything so I could have them without thinking about price. That's point of their sacrifice, Ethan. They died so you could live without thinking about war, could grow up in peace, could have choices they never got to make because duty called first. Arthur's health was declining more rapidly than admitted when stress of approaching Veterans Day ceremony had been complicated by Parkinson's progression that medical management couldn't entirely control, despite treatment. Doctor says emotional stress can accelerate symptoms. Reading those names is important to me, but physical limitations might prevent completing ceremony that honors their memory appropriately. What if something happens during ceremony? What if I freeze up when faced with community expectations that experience hasn't prepared me to handle despite good intentions? Ethan's commitment to helping had created stakes beyond personal comfort when public failure might dishonor memory of fallen soldiers. That ceremony had been designed to commemorate through proper reverence. These aren't just names to read aloud, son. Each one was someone's child, husband, brother. Their families might be in attendance expecting dignity that mistakes could violate through inexperience. Then teach me how to do it right. Show me what each name means so I can honor them properly if you need me to take over. The approaching ceremony had become test that would determine whether transformation had been genuine, when pressure would reveal character that convenience couldn't demonstrate through comfortable circumstances that challenge hadn't been providing. Weather forecast shows possible storm for Veterans Day. Ceremony might be moved indoors or canceled, which would mean waiting another year that my health might not allow attending. But as Veterans Day morning arrived with unexpected crisis, Arthur's stroke would transform Ethan's offer to help into a sacred duty and prove that sometimes heroism isn't about choosing courage, but about finding it when there's no choice left except to honor those who gave everything. Arthur, Arthur! Ethan's voice cracked with panic when he arrived at 6 a.m. for pre-ceremony breakfast and found the 92-year-old Marine collapsed in his kitchen. Speech slurred left side, paralyzed eyes, still alert, but unable to form words that fear was trying to speak. "I'm calling 911. Stay with me, sir. Don't you dare die before you see those boys honored today." EMT response was swift, but prognosis was devastating. When stroke damage had been assessed through neurological testing, that speech and mobility functions had been compromised despite consciousness that determination was trying to maintain. Massive cerebrovascular accident affecting motor and speech centers. Patient is stable, but unlikely to regain speech or mobility sufficient for public appearance today. Doctor, the ceremony is in 4 hours. He's supposed to read names of his fallen soldiers. He's been preparing for this all week, like it was his final mission. Son, I understand this is important, but patient can't speak coherently, and physical presentation would be inappropriate for public ceremony. That dignity requires maintaining. Arthur's eyes held desperate plea when communication was impossible except through expression that understanding didn't require words to convey despite frustration that circumstances had created. He's trying to tell me something about the ceremony, about the names, about promises he made to families that honor required keeping despite medical emergency. Hospital chaplain had been called when spiritual crisis had been identified through family consultation that medical limitations couldn't address, despite emotional needs that professional care required acknowledging. Sometimes, the most sacred promises are the ones we can't keep ourselves but must trust others to fulfill through commitment that love has established rather than obligation. Ethan, you don't understand the weight of this responsibility. George's caution came when grandson had volunteered to replace Arthur despite inexperience that public ceremony would expose through pressure that preparation couldn't eliminate. Those names aren't just reading exercise. Each one represents family's worst day, parents' greatest loss, community's debt that words alone can never adequately repay through ceremony. Then teach me how to carry it properly. Arthur trusted me enough to prepare me for this. I can't let him down when he's already given everything for people he'll never be able to honor personally. Veterans Day ceremony coordination had created crisis when keynote speaker had been hospitalized. Despite advanced preparation, that substitution would require making through emergency procedures that dignity demanded maintaining. VFW commander says ceremony can be postponed until Arthur recovers, but weather forecast shows storm system approaching that might prevent rescheduling for weeks. Arthur would want ceremony to proceed on schedule. These fallen soldiers have been waiting 72 years for recognition. That delay shouldn't be permitted to postpone through medical emergency. Community expectations had created pressure when hundreds of attendees would be disappointed by cancellation, despite understanding that circumstances had created impossible situation that solutions couldn't easily provide. What if I mess up? What if I mispronounce names or break down emotionally when facing families whose losses these names represent through sacrifice that gratitude requires acknowledging properly. Then you'll be human, son. But you'll be human who tried to honor heroes instead of human who mocked them without understanding what they'd sacrificed. Arthur's hospital room became planning center when ceremony details had to be transferred despite communication limitations that stroke had created through speech impediments that understanding would require overcoming. Arthur squeezed my hand once for yes, twice for no. Do you want me to read the names today? Single squeeze came with intensity that determination had provided despite physical limitations that stroke had created through motor control that willpower was trying to overcome. Do you trust me to honor them properly, even though I'm just 17 and don't have military experience? That understanding requires another single squeeze accompanied by tears that emotion couldn't prevent, despite military bearing that control had been trying to maintain through dignity. George, he's given me his blessing. Arthur Sullivan, who saved your life in Korea, trusts me to honor his fallen comrades despite every reason he should doubt my worthiness. Then we better make sure you're ready, son. These names aren't just words, they're sacred trust that failure would dishonor despite good intentions. That effort alone can't guarantee. Preparation became intensive when 3 hours remained for learning proper pronunciation, historical context, and ceremonial protocol that respect required following despite time constraints that mastery couldn't be achieved through. Each name gets individual moment of silence. Look at families and audience when reading their boy's name. Remember, these were real people with dreams that war ended before fulfillment could be achieved. But as Ethan stood before the mirror practicing names he'd never heard before, he realized this wasn't just about reading words aloud. It was about becoming worthy of Arthur's trust and proving that mockery could be transformed into reverence. When honor demands, we rise above who we were to become who we need to be. Memorial Park had filled beyond capacity when Veterans Day ceremony had attracted community attention that Arthur's hospitalization had intensified rather than diminished through sympathy that collective respect had been providing. Crowd is larger than usual. Word spread about Arthur's stroke and teenagers stepping in to honor fallen soldiers. People want to witness act of respect that generational understanding had made meaningful. Ethan's preparation was meticulous when sacred duty had required attention to detail. That casual approach couldn't provide despite nervousness. That responsibility had been creating through pressure that experience hadn't prepared him to handle. List of 17 names with phonetic pronunciation, brief biography for each soldier family members who might be present, proper ceremonial protocol that military tradition requires maintaining through dignity. Remember, son, speak slowly, clearly with reverence. Make eye contact with families when reading their loved one's name. This is their moment to grieve publicly and receive community acknowledgement that sacrifice deserves. Weather had cleared despite forecast when morning sun had emerged through clouds that ceremony's importance had seemed to arrange through atmospheric cooperation that significance had been earning through collective reverence. Arthur would be proud to see community turnout. These ceremonies matter because they prove memory outlasts individual lifespans when commitment to honor transcends personal limitations through shared responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, today's ceremony will be conducted by 17-year-old Ethan Mitchell. representing Lieutenant Arthur Sullivan, who suffered medical emergency but insisted ceremony proceed as scheduled to honor our fallen heroes. Microphone felt heavy when responsibility had been transferred through trust that inexperience couldn't eliminate, despite preparation that confidence should have been providing through readiness that fear was complicating. I'm not qualified to speak for heroes. I'm teenager who mocked Lieutenant Sullivan last week without understanding who he was or what he'd sacrificed for my freedom to be ignorant and cruel. Honesty created connection when admission of fault had provided credibility that pretense couldn't duplicate, despite vulnerability that strength would require demonstrating through commitment rather than perfection. But Lieutenant Sullivan trusted me with this duty despite my unworthiness. So I'll try to honor these 17 boys who died in Korea, believing their sacrifice mattered for something bigger than themselves. Audience silence was complete when sincerity had been recognized through words that experience, rather than rehearsal, had been providing through understanding that transformation had been motivating rather than obligation. Private First Class Michael Anthony Battaglia, age 19, killed in action October 14, 1952, during a Chinese assault on Bloody Ridge. Survived by parents Angelo and Maria Battaglia. Sister Catherine. Elderly woman in front row began crying when her brother's name had been spoken with reverence that 72 years of silence had been waiting to hear through public acknowledgement that memory deserved. Corporal James Robert Chen, age 20, killed in action October 15, 1952, while providing covering fire for wounded comrades' evacuation. First-generation American, whose parents had immigrated for opportunities their son died defending. Each name carried weight when biographical details had been researched through commitment that honor required providing, despite time constraints that thoroughness had been making challenging but necessary for proper respect. Sergeant William David Murphy, age 22, killed in action October 16, 1952, leading counterattack that saved defensive position. Posthumously awarded Silver Star for gallantry that sacrifice had earned through leadership, Private Daniel George Morrison, age 18. Ethan's voice broke when name had triggered recognition that George was his grandfather's given name, making sacrifice personal rather than historical. Killed in action October 17, 1952, one day before his 19th birthday. Letta Home mentioned girlfriend he planned to marry when war ended. Tears came despite attempts at composure when emotional impact had overwhelmed preparation through recognition that these weren't names but interrupted lives that dreams hadn't been allowed to complete. I'm sorry. These weren't just soldiers. They were sons and brothers and boyfriends who had plans and hopes and futures that war took away before they could live them. Audience support was evident when community had recognized authentic emotion rather than performance through grief that shared humanity had been providing despite generational differences, that understanding had been transcending. Take your time, son. They've been waiting 72 years. Few more minutes won't matter to them, but it matters to us that you get this right. Lieutenant Arthur Sullivan crawled through machine gun fire to save my grandfather during this battle. These 17 boys didn't get saved. They died so people like Lieutenant Sullivan could save people like my grandfather, so people like me could grow up free. Understanding had crystallized when personal connection had been made to sacrifice that gratitude rather than obligation had been requiring acknowledgement through recognition that debt couldn't be repaid but could be honored. Private Richard Allen Patterson, age 19. Sergeant Thomas Michael O'Brien, age 21. Corporal Stephen Joseph Walsh, age 20. Each name received individual attention when commitment had been renewed through recognition that ceremony wasn't performance, but sacred duty. That completion required, despite emotional difficulty, that respect demanded accepting. These 17 Marines died believing America was worth dying for. Lieutenant Sullivan survived believing America was worth living for. Today, I learned both were right. In closing, Lieutenant Sullivan wanted me to say that freedom isn't free. It's purchased with blood of people who chose duty over safety service, over self-country, over comfort. Standing ovation lasted 5 minutes when community had recognized transformation that genuine rather than performed had been accomplished through commitment that character rather than obligation had been demonstrating. These boys died so teenagers like me could be free to make mistakes and learn from them. Today, I learned that growing up means accepting responsibility for honoring those who made our freedom possible. American flag was raised to full staff when ceremony conclusion had been reached through completion that dignity rather than perfection had been providing despite inexperience, that sincerity had been overcoming. Son, you honored them beautifully. Arthur would be proud of how you transformed mockery into reverence through commitment that character development had been demonstrating. This is just beginning, Grandpa. I want to join Marines after graduation. Want to serve country that Lieutenant Sullivan and those 17 boys died protecting through sacrifice that gratitude requires repaying. Hospital visit that evening revealed Arthur conscious and improved when ceremony success had been reported through communication that recovery had been inspiring despite stroke limitations that determination was overcoming. He squeezed my hand when I told him about ceremony. I think he knows his boys were honored properly despite his absence. That duty had been continued through. But the most profound change was yet to come when Ethan's transformation from cruel teenager to respectful young man would inspire an entire generation to understand that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear the wisdom of those who recognize heroism in others. Ethan's Veterans Day performance had become viral sensation when video of teenager honoring fallen Marines had attracted national attention, demonstrating that respect could be learned and that heroism was recognizable across generational lines. His decision to enlist in Marines after graduation had been influenced by understanding that service was privilege rather than burden, when freedom required defending through commitment that comfort couldn't provide despite personal cost. Arthur's recovery had been remarkable when purpose had been provided through mentoring relationship that isolation couldn't duplicate, proving that healing occurred through connection rather than withdrawal from community engagement. Community recognition had elevated veteran status when ceremony had reminded residents that heroes lived among them deserving honor rather than being forgotten through indifference that appreciation should have been preventing. Mitchell Protocol had been adopted by 34 school districts nationwide when educational programs connecting students with local veterans had proven more effective than textbook learning for teaching respect and historical understanding. Marine Corps had featured Ethan's story in recruitment materials when authentic respect rather than patriotic slogans, had been shown to inspire genuine service. That character, rather than benefits, had been motivating. Veterans outreach programs had been revolutionized when intergenerational connections had proven therapeutic for both elderly veterans needing purpose and young people requiring role models that wisdom could provide. Arthur's story had influenced federal legislation protecting veteran benefits when public awareness had been raised about needs that previous advocacy couldn't achieve through political action that emotion had been providing. Educational partnerships had reached 75,000 students annually, when curriculum incorporating veteran interviews had been developed through programs that living history rather than textbook study could provide more effectively. Ethan's evolution from cruel teenager to Marine recruit had demonstrated that character could be developed when proper examples had been provided through relationships that respect rather than fear had been establishing. His ongoing care for Arthur had created surrogate grandfather relationship when family bonds had been chosen rather than inherited through commitment that love could maintain despite difficulties that age would create. Arthur's role as mentor and historian had provided purpose that retirement couldn't eliminate when wisdom could be shared through teaching that isolation had been preventing before connection had been established. Their partnership had become model for veteran youth programs when mutual benefit had been demonstrated through relationships that service, rather than charity, had been motivating between generations that understanding could connect. Sometimes the most profound lessons about honor come not from books or lectures, but from the moment when disrespect meets dignity, and we discover that the heroes we've been taught to revere have been sitting quietly among us all along, waiting for us to grow wise enough to see them proving that respect isn't inherited but earned through recognition that sacrifice deserves gratitude regardless of how much time has passed since blood was shed for freedoms we take for granted, and that the greatest honor we can give our veterans isn't parades or speeches, but the commitment to live worthy of the price they paid for our liberty, becoming the citizens they fought to protect, rather than the ungrateful beneficiaries of courage we're too comfortable to recognize until wisdom forces us to see that heroism surrounds us in ordinary people who did extraordinary things when duty called their names. Their remarkable relationship demonstrated that transformation was possible when respect replaced ridicule, inspiring thousands to believe that generational understanding could bridge any gap when heroes were willing to teach and students were ready to learn that freedom isn't free, but purchased with sacrifice that gratitude must honor through service to ideals that transcend individual comfort or convenience.